have got to know whether or not their president should trust.
Read my lips.
American people have voted to make a new beginning.
There is no limit to the greatness of America.
Yes, we can.
Hi there, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
Coming up, one of the top Tea Partiers in the United States tells us how he will work with President Mitt Romney, if there is one, and a tribute as well to the late George McGovern.
And we're going to be talking to Senator Evan Bayh, the man who might have been Vice President had everything been completely different. But first, the news.
And with less than 2 weeks to go now, the US presidential election is shaping up potentially to be a real cliffhanger, with Republican Mitt Romney consolidating his lead in national polls, but President Obama still holding a small advantage in the crucial swing states. Polls out today from ABC News, Gallup and Rasmussen have come to the same conclusion. Mitt Romney is now leading by 3 percentage points nationally, 50 to 47. But the average of state polls paints a different picture for President Obama. He still leads by more than 2 percentage points in Ohio, Iowa, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan and Minnesota. Governor Romney, meanwhile, has a significant lead in North Carolina, although that is closing a little, and smaller leads in Florida and Virginia. Colorado and New Hampshire effectively tied. Now, if an election had been held today, President Obama would have won by a very narrow margin, just 11 Electoral College votes more than the 270 he needs to win. But the trend lines are generally much better at the moment for Mitt Romney.
Now, while we're drilling down, John, let's drill down just that little bit further.
Alrighty.
Nate Silver, who's an excellent election analyst on the 538 blog on the New York Times website, he runs about 40,000 election simulations a day on his computer. That's a lot of simulations. And he says that at this point in time, the winner of Ohio wins the election in 95% of those simulations. So like we always say, keep your eyes on Ohio. It was because of Ohio that I infamously predicted Obama would win the election a month ago, and it's Ohio that I'm going to be watching in 12 days' time. Ohio.
And you're not the only one that's going to be watching Ohio in 12 days' time, that's for sure. Yet to have an impact on any of the polls we're seeing this week are the recent controversial comments by the Republican Senate candidate in Indiana, Richard Murdoch. Mr Murdoch is a Tea Party-backed Republican candidate who beat the more moderate Richard Lugar in the primary. Here's what he said in a candidate debate earlier this week.
I struggled with it myself for a long time, but I came to realize life is that gift from God. And I think even when life begins in that horrible situation of rape, that it is something that God intended to happen.
Now, Mitt Romney's campaign has released a statement. It says the governor doesn't agree with the comments and they do not reflect his views. The remarks brought back some memories, though, of Missouri Republican Senate candidate Todd Akin's rather infamous comments about legitimate rape a few months ago and potentially endanger not just the Indiana Senate seat, but as well the Republicans' newfound support amongst female voters nationally. Mr Murdoch, for his part, was quick to apologise.
Life is precious and that I abhor violence, and I'm confident God abhors violence and rape. If they came away with any impression other than that, I truly regret it. I apologize if they came away.
Look, this could be a big deal in the election, John. As you say, Richard Murdoch is running in the once safe Republican state of Indiana, and if the Dems can pinch this seat off the Republicans, it's going to pretty much guarantee them control of the Senate. So that's a big deal. But time out. Time out for a second. I can't believe I'm doing this, but I'm going to defend the guy. If you look at Murdoch's full comments in context, he wasn't trying to talk about rape. He was essentially arguing that life begins at conception and that all life is God's will, rape, incest or otherwise, all life. Now, sure, he said it in a very shoddy way, but life being God's will and beginning at conception is something that a lot of Americans believe. Now, obviously, if you're pro-choice, you're not going to vote for the guy, and fair enough, but when Obama is saying things like this...
Let me make a very simple proposition. Rape is rape. It is a crime.
Obama right there is implying that Murdoch is defending or trivialising rape. Now, Murdoch simply isn't. He isn't talking about rape at all. He's talking about the lives of fetuses. And I think his comments are being intentionally misconstrued by his opponents, and the press have gone along for the ride. And I don't even want to know what people are saying about me on Twitter right now, so let's move on.
All right.
Someone's got to defend him.
Now, it does already seem like a long, long time ago, but earlier this week we saw the third and final presidential debate in Boca Raton, Florida. The foreign policy debate veered often into domestic political point scoring at times, and there were few substantial differences on the handling of issues like Libya, Iran, Syria and the Arab Spring, although defence cuts and even the size of the US Navy fleet became a point of difference.
The Navy is smaller now than any time since 1917. Since FDR, we've always had the strategy of saying we could fight in 2 conflicts at once. Now we're changing to 1 conflict. And I will not cut our military budget by $1 trillion, which is the combination of the budget cuts that the president has, as well as the sequestration cuts. That, in my view, is making our future less certain and less secure.
First of all, the sequester is not something that I proposed. It's something that Congress has proposed. It will not happen. The budget that we're talking about is not reducing our military spending. It's maintaining it. You mentioned the Navy, for example, and that we have fewer ships than we did in 1916. Well, Governor, we also have fewer horses and bayonets because the nature of our military has changed.
Now, I thought this was a key moment in the debate because, as you say, the size of the military is almost the only foreign policy question that Obama and Romney actually substantially disagree upon, as opposed to rhetoric. Now, Romney's promise to increase the size of the military is also a pretty classic political tactic, which is why I found it so interesting to see Obama aggressively attack it like he did there. But a few points need to be made. Firstly, it's not true that the Navy is the smallest it's been since 1916 in terms of ship numbers. It was smaller in 2007 under George W. Bush. Funny how Romney forgot that bit. Secondly, if you examine American naval power as a percentage of the world's total naval power, America has about 50% of the world's total naval power, which is more than it's had at any time in history. It's not the right graphic, but trust me. And thirdly, before Obama wants to get all cute with his lines about horses and bayonets, he might want to check his facts, because there are way, way more bayonets in the military today than there were in 1916. Surprisingly,
really?
Yes. We're talking 600,000 bayonets exist today in the military compared to about 200,000 in 1916. So there you go. You learn something every day on Plain America.
Yeah.
A trivial point. I know it's a trivial point, but it's like those guys on the internet who make spelling mistakes themselves while they criticise your grammar. I hate those guys. While I'm running hot, one more thing about the debates. It's a cliche that debates are good for challengers because they elevate the challenger in the eyes of the public. They get to be all gravitas-y. Well, here's some evidence. Some wonks have graphed the instant polls about who won each debate against the eventual poll bounce that the victors gained. And you've already seen this graphic, so you might as well look at it one more time. That's the graphic there. There's a trend line there showing that the more an incumbent is judged to have won a debate, that's the bottom line, the bigger their bounce is. That's the vertical line. It makes sense, but here's where it gets interesting. If you look at the line for a 0% bump for the incumbent, look at just on the vertical line here at the 0, and you draw across and then go down, you'll see that the incumbent needs to win the post-debate polls by about 30% to get 0 bounce. In other words, if the incumbent doesn't smash the challenger, the very existence of debates is bad news for the incumbent. So if that's the case, Obama won the third debate in a number of polls by about 10 points.
Right.
He can not only expect no bounce from that, but it might even help Romney.
That's not particularly good news for him right now.
No, it's not.
Now, it is already estimated that about 1 in 3 American voters will have cast their ballot before Election Day on November the 6th. And today, President Obama became one of them. In doing so, he became the first president to vote early. And back in his home state of Illinois earlier today, he called on others to do the same.
You notice my voice is getting a little hoarse. But I'm just going to keep on. Keeping on. Until every single person out there who needs to vote is going to go vote.
Meanwhile, the President today received a significant endorsement from former US Secretary of State and Republican Colin Powell.
Well, you know, I voted for him in 2008, and I plan to stick with him in 2012, and I'll be voting for he and for Vice President Joe Biden next month.
That's an endorsement of President Obama for re-election.
Yes.
Meanwhile, former independent presidential candidate and businessman Ross Perot endorsed Mitt Romney this week, saying that America can't afford 4 more years of Barack Obama. And another businessman who occasionally flirts with politics, Donald Trump, re-entered the fray this week as well. Mr. Trump is a prominent birther, of course, who doubts Barack Obama was even born in America, therefore eligible to be President of the United States. The property tycoon has offered to pay a charity of the president's choosing $5 million if Barack Obama releases his college and passport applications.
If Barack Obama opens up and gives his college records and applications, and if he gives his passport applications and records, I will give to a charity of his choice a check immediately for $5 million.
Perhaps not surprisingly, President Obama laughed off the offer. Finally this week, to the news of the death of Senator George McGovern at the age of 90. The 1972 Democratic presidential nominee who opposed the war in Vietnam lost in a landslide to incumbent President Richard Nixon. Many of McGovern's policies, though, once dismissed as way too liberal, were enacted by either President Carter or President Reagan. Speaking at a memorial service in Sioux Falls, South Dakota earlier today, Vice President Joe Biden described McGovern as the father of the modern Democratic Party and the reason he went into politics. When I met George McGovern a few years ago, he was still sounding a little wistful about what might have been.
It's too bad that we lost in '72. It really is. That could have been a turning point in American history. If I had won, I would have quickly taken the United States out of the war. In Vietnam, I would have gone overboard to treat the veterans of that war more justly than they have been. And then I would have begun to divert the enormous resources we poured into the Vietnam War, close to $1 trillion, to divert those resources into things like health care, universal health care, to the United States.
Mr. President, can we talk? In 2008, the gas prices were as high as they are now. The last president signed a single executive order to open up 100 offshore oil wells. By the end of the year, the gas prices were under $2 per gallon. Mr. President, you can do the very same thing today, but you said you won't. Why, Mr. President? Why?
I didn't think it was possible, but after that ad, I've just become dumber.
Now to Evan Bayh, who is a former United States Senator and Governor of this great state of Indiana. A centrist Democrat, Senator Bayh was on the shortlist to become Barack Obama's vice presidential running mate 4 years ago. As you might recall, he missed out. He does come from good political pedigree as well. His father, Birch Bayh, was a long-time Democratic senator and a presidential candidate himself in 1976. Evan Bayh left politics 2 years ago, appalled, he said, at the partisanship in Washington, D.C. Senator Bayh spoke to us earlier from New York. So tell us, what is your take on the campaign right now, less than 2 weeks out from the election? It is very, very close, depending on what polls you look at. Just 3 weeks ago, President Obama was coasting, almost 5% in front. What's gone wrong?
Well, the election is going to be very close. Governor Romney had a very good first debate, and that did a lot to undermine the caricature of him as an out-of-touch plutocrat. The president has an advantage in our electoral college. As your viewers will remember, Al Gore got the most popular votes in our country, but did not win the electoral college. George Bush won that, so he became president. And the electoral college has a slight tilt toward the Democratic Party. But Governor Romney has succeeded in focusing on the economy. Most Americans don't like the direction of our economy, and anytime you're the incumbent, you tend to get more of the blame for that.
That caricature that you talk about of Governor Romney, did the Obama campaign, in retrospect, rely too much on a negative attack on Mitt Romney and not enough on a positive vision for the future?
Perhaps so, with the benefit of hindsight. The theory of the case was that this was going to be an election like 2004, in which George W. Bush attacked John Kerry and basically, although Bush was not that popular, made voters even more uncomfortable with Senator Kerry. And so the theory was that this was going to be, rather than a referendum on the direction of the country, and to quote Ronald Reagan's famous line, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" the Obama campaign instead would make it a choice between two individuals, and although undecided voters might be not entirely comfortable with President Obama, they'd be even more uncomfortable with Mitt Romney. That was their theory. As it turns out, they probably needed to do both. Make the contrast and point out some of Governor Romney's weaknesses, but at the same time tell people, look, here's what I intend to do if you hire me for the next 4 years. As former President Clinton has famously said, running for public office is essentially a job interview, and you need to do more than run down the other applicants. You need to tell the folks who are going to be doing the hiring, the voters, why you do a good job for them.
Senator, it would be great if they did run a positive agenda, but if you're in Barack Obama's position, what could your positive agenda be when the country's in the situation it is at the moment? It's very hard for an incumbent to run right now and say, I've got all these wonderful things to do over the next 4 years, and they'd say, well, why haven't you done them for the last 4 years?
Well, I think a little candor would be in order, and the president can rightfully say, look, when you hired me for this job, the economy was terrible, the budget was exploding, we were in 2 wars that were seemingly endless. Are we where we would like to be today? No, I'm not happy with that either, the president could say. But you can't possibly go back to the policies that got us into this position in the first place, which is what Governor Romney is embracing from the president's point of view. And by the way, here's what I intend to do over the next 4 years as we continue to move the economy in a better direction, try and get the deficit under control, and do a number of other things for middle-class families. Here's what I intend to do for you for the next 4 years. And so he could have a narrative like that without saying, look, things are great. The last 4 years have been entirely successful. That wouldn't be credible. But the narrative that I laid out probably would resonate with Americans.
Senator, you've spoken a lot over the last couple of years about the growing partisanship and rancour in Washington. I'm just wondering, we've spoken about the debates recently, and one of the lessons of the debates seems to be that the more aggressive you are, the better people seem to think you go. Like, the person who seems to go the most aggressively in the debate seems to always be declared the winner. I'm just wondering, is it just the nature of us as people who consume politics, and I'm talking about the people here, that they like partisanship and they like people fighting with each other?
Well, a certain amount of aggressiveness is a part of leadership. I mean, people don't want someone who's passive or seems disinterested in the job. And so the president was a little listless in the first debate. Governor Romney, for him, the bar was set so low when he showed up and showed that he had a pulse and was seemed like a decent person, that then punctured that caricature that had been created about him, and so comparatively he did very well. The president did show much more energy in the next 2 debates and was judged to be the debate winner by most objective observers. However, to get to your question, when you come across very aggressive and very hot like that, it tends to appeal to your most fervent supporters and get them excited, and they're more likely to come out and vote. It remains to be seen whether that sort of very aggressive approach appeals to undecided independent voters who tend to not like their politicians quite so hot. They tend to like a little more reasonableness, a little more dispassion, and so we'll just have to see. So what appeals to the 2 bases may not be what appeals to that final 5 or 6% of undecideds who will ultimately determine who the next president is going to be.
Senator, can we look ahead over the next couple of weeks? The storied Obama campaign infrastructure, the get out the vote machine that they built 4 years ago, seems to be delivering in some of the early voting in places like Ohio and Iowa as well, with a substantial lead in the early count there. Do you feel, is your gut feeling that that is going to be decisive, that could get Democrats over the line, or are they in serious trouble?
Well, in a very close election, the get-out-the-vote operation can be the deciding factor. And this is going to be a 1% election one way or the other. So the fact that the president has had 4 years to really work in these key states, to hone his get-out-the-vote operation, will stand him in good stead. But Governor Romney has something else going for him. He was distracted by the primary, had to deplete his resources, and that was not helpful to him. But now if you look at a lot of the polling data, by a slight majority, slight margin I should say, 4, 5, 6%, the Republican Party base just seems to be much more energized, willing to walk over hot coals to go vote. and that may be enough to offset the president's advantage in terms of getting out students, casual voters who aren't that interested. The president will do better with regard to that. But it looks like the Republican Party base is more enthusiastic, and they will self-motivate and go vote. And so that's one of the reasons this could be a very late night in America, and your viewers there in Australia could be, who are interested in this kind of thing, it could be, conceivably we could look at state recounts to decide who ultimately is elected president. And I wouldn't be surprised if the president won the Electoral College, but Mitt Romney narrowly won the popular vote. It could be that close.
A very late afternoon in Australia. To turn to the Senate briefly, you've got obviously a lot of expertise about Indiana. Indiana's been in the news in the last week with Richard Murdoch's comments. Wondering, do you think that state is genuinely in play in the Senate? Absolutely, it's in play. And it's a manifestation, an example of what's happening in our politics. If the incumbent Republican senator, Richard Lugar, had been renominated, we wouldn't even have a competitive Senate race in my state. But because the much more conservative candidate associated with what is called the Tea Party movement defeated him in the primary, now it's a very competitive race. And in the most recent polls that I've seen and have confidence in, the Democratic nominee was actually ahead by 2 or 3%. Now, that was before the very controversial comments that Mr. Murdoch made last night about rape and pregnancies resulting from rape, apparently in his opinion, being ordained by God. And that, I can imagine, with independent, moderate women voters in particular, will not set very well. So it's a very competitive race in Indiana. I actually give the Democrat a slight advantage now. Part of it, however, will be decided by the margin of the presidential race. Mitt Romney has an advantage in my state, will probably carry my state. If he carries it by less than 10%, I think the Democratic candidate will win. And regardless of who wins the presidency, whether it be Obama or Romney, is the Senate governable in 2013? Is it in such a state of rancor that, with the filibuster and all the rest of it, that no one can do anything? Or do you think there's some hope there? Well, it reminds me of what Winston Churchill once famously said about democracy, which was it's the worst form of government except all the others. And so the Senate has become very difficult, largely because of the filibuster, which is the supermajority requirement. It's going to be very close. My best guess is it will be 52 Democrat, 48 Republican, or 51-49. Very close. Neither side will have enough votes to get to the 60-vote threshold. So as a result, things don't get done. However, there are some things that have to get done, and outside forces will be at play. Our fiscal situation, the so-called fiscal cliff, is coming up at the end of the year. If the Senate does nothing, then every American taxpayer, not just the wealthy, but everyone, will have their taxes go up. Spending will be slashed across the board in ways that will hurt the poor. It will devastate the military. These things can't be allowed to happen, but they're currently on autopilot, written into the law, and will happen unless Congress decides to do something else. So my best guess is that after the election, there will be a lot of fighting. They'll go right up to the deadline. There will be a lot of turbulence in the financial markets, but eventually they'll come up with a framework to resolve this problem. But really the hard work will be put off for another 6 months. And so the first 6 months of the next year will be spent fleshing in all the details about what's going to happen with regard to tax changes, spending changes, and changes to our entitlement systems, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Finally, Senator, one of the icons of the Democratic Party, Senator George McGovern, the 1972 presidential nominee, died this week at the age of 90. What should his legacy be? How does he deserve to be remembered? Well, George McGovern deserves to be remembered as a very decent human being who cared about the people of his state, the people of our country. He stood for many progressive policies that at the time seemed to be, very far to the left, but some today that seem to be more mainstream. And he'll go down in history as someone who lost a presidential election, but never lost his integrity, never lost his sense of decency. And looking at politics today, that's saying a lot. And when you look at what happened to the winner in that race, Richard Nixon, you might say that George McGovern will be remembered better in history than will the winner of that campaign. Evan Bayh, many thanks indeed for joining us this week. Great to be with you. Just off Evan Bayh's comments there about Obama needing to run on a positive agenda. Well, we did see this week Obama release a pamphlet filled with policy. Well, kind of. It included graphs like this about employment in the manufacturing sector. Now look at all those manufacturing jobs being created, and they just go on and on forever, lots and lots of jobs. Except, what if we don't just show the last 2 years? What if we show the last 4 years? Now, the graph we show was at the top there. At the bottom, you can see the last 4 years that it went down an awful lot more from 2009 than it's gone up since. Now, admittedly, manufacturing's been going down for decades, so any increase at all is welcome, but that's fairly dodgy stuff from Obama there in his pamphlet. And don't let the release of that pamphlet fool you, because we're pretty far from Evan Bayh's campaign paradise. Have a look at this breakdown of ads over the last 3 weeks. Only 6.3% of Obama's ads are positive at the moment. 20% are contrast ads, which means they're about both him and Romney. 73% are negative ads solely about Mitt Romney. That compared to only 36% of Romney's ads, which are negative about Obama. Draw your own conclusions.
The stuff some folks are saying about President Obama sounds kind of familiar. The same people said my ideas would destroy jobs, and they called me every name in the book. Well, we created 22 million new jobs and turned deficits into surpluses. President Obama's got it right. We should invest in the middle class, education, and innovation, and pay down our debt with spending restraint and asking the wealthy to pay a little more. Sound familiar?
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
Less than 4 years ago, some pundits were predicting the end of the Republican Party after losing their House and Senate majorities in 2006, then the White House, of course, in 2008. There were many Conservatives in deep despair. And then along came the Tea Party, the anti-tax small government movement that reinvigorated the Conservative base of the Republican Party. While the movement is hard to define and rather loosely organised, one of its most influential figures is Matt Kibbe. He's president of the group Freedom Works. I spoke to Matt Kibbe recently and asked him about the effect of the Tea Party on Conservative politics in America.
Well, you know, first of all, it's not a political party, and party refers to something else, and I think that always created a lot of confusion about who we are and what this community represents. It was a protest movement. We did take to the streets, but it evolved quite naturally into a get-out-the-vote machine. But what's interesting and different about the Tea Party from a political party is that it really is based on a set of ideas about limited government and individual freedom that hold people together, and that has changed, I think, fundamentally the conversation in the United States. We're now talking about how do we stop spending money we don't have as a government? How do we get the government out of so many aspects of our lives? This conversation wasn't happening before the emergence of the Tea Party.
So is it fair to say that once Tea Party supporters didn't get their preferred presidential nominee, once Romney was the presumptive nominee, their attention shifted down ticket to other races in the Senate and the House?
The action's mostly in the Senate. Every Tea Partier I know wants to fire Barack Obama, but they're more interested in taking the Senate and making sure that we repopulate the Senate with fiscal conservatives that actually mean what they say, are willing to tackle some of the financial issues we have, including entitlements, including dealing with a corrupt tax code, and including not spending money we don't have. But what's interesting about the electoral map is that all of the states that matter in this presidential cycle are states that Barack Obama won in 2008, and I'm talking about Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and others. Those same states were won by the Tea Party in 2010. They flipped state legislatures, they took governor's mansions, and generally speaking, that's where the Republican House majority came from in 2010. In 2012, all of those same states matter to Romney, of course, but we have Senate candidates and Senate pickups in almost all of those states. So the fate of the Senate and the fate of who is the next president are probably intertwined.
If Mitt Romney is elected president in just over a month's time, how will Tea Party Republicans, who a lot of them said he's way too moderate, you know, he's really not severely conservative, he's just saying that to get the nomination, he'll probably try and govern from closer to the centre. How's that going to work if the balance of power in both houses, potentially, if Romney wins, the coattails suggest that you got a Tea Party balance of power in both chambers?
Well, if Romney wins, it means that we certainly took the Senate, and we probably took it with a predominance of what I would call the Freedom Caucus, the 2010 class of Tea Partiers, which was historically large. but also historically focused on fiscal conservatism. That's unusual in the U.S. Senate, but if you look at champions like Ted Cruz and Richard Murdoch, certainly Connie Mack in Florida, and others, you're talking about an activist Senate, a Senate that is going to write budgets, a Senate that is going to offer legislation, push it through the House, and push it to the President's desk. That's our strategy. The strategy has to be a legislature that's accountable to people, a legislature that's trying to fix problems. They're not going to wait for President Romney to tell them what H.R. 1 is. It's going to come from the bottom up.
If Barack Obama does win in November, and he's ahead in most polls most of the time and has been for over a year, would you then consider that he has a mandate to address issues like debt in his way?
Well, what's interesting is it's not always clear what it is Barack Obama wants to do. The secret in Washington that no one pays much attention to is the fact that the Democrats can't pass a budget. And the budget is the governing document that tells you what economic policy is for the White House, for the legislature. Senate Democrats haven't even been able to pass one in the last 3 years. So that doesn't bode well if Democrats win another election. I think it really depends on the size of that victory. It's hard to defeat an incumbent president. Americans want their president to succeed. So the fact that this is a competitive race, and I think it is still, I think that that's an indictment on the current administration. It means that people are frustrated enough to look for an alternative.
The 112th Congress, ending this year, is officially the least productive, most partisan in American history. A lot of people say that's because of those Tea Partiers that got elected at the end of 2010. How much responsibility or credit do Tea Partiers take for the fact that not a lot's getting done on Capitol Hill these days?
Well, if productivity is measured by how many bills you pass, I hope it's true that this has been an unproductive Congress. If productivity is measured based on whether or not you confronted the real fiscal problems that this country faces, like entitlement spending, like $16 trillion in debt, we at least turned the Titanic away from the iceberg. We're actually talking about how to balance the budget. We're actually talking about these things. But it is a standstill. And I don't think that a standstill that has stopped us from driving off the cliff is unproductive.
Matt Kibbe, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
In the last few years, America's been knocked down. 23 million people can't find full-time work. And we borrow $4 billion every single day, much of it from China. When someone doesn't get the job done, you gotta hold them accountable. Obama's second term would be a rerun of the first, and our country just couldn't survive that. We need someone who could turn it around fast, and that man is Mitt Romney. There's not much time left, and the future of our country is at stake.
Time for the Roundish Table. Joining us this week, Dave Levine from Democrats Abroad and American politics commentator James Morrow. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
First to you, Dave. We've got just over a week and a half out from this election. It is incredibly close, much closer than it looked as though it was going to be maybe just a month ago. What do you think are going to be the key issues in the next week and a half?
I think there are two key issues. The first is the economy. It's what this presidential election has been about the whole time, and I think that President Obama really needs to prove to the American people that he has the plan for the future, that he's the person who has the vision, that he's been doing a good job. He needs to remind them of the jobs that he's brought. I think another issue has been brought up in this last week, which is women's rights, reproductive rights, and gender equality has really been a paramount issue through some of the debates, and much more so than I think people anticipated.
On the economy thing, when you're saying he needs to prove that he's the man for stewardship for the economy, etc. He's been talking non-stop about the economy for the last year. What does he need to say different to what he's already said? Because he's been saying it over and over again.
Well, for one thing, he needs to point out the flaws in the Romney plan. And
I think he's been trying.
Yeah, he has. But really, a lot of undecided voters haven't been paying attention until now. So really, the truth in a good message is how many times do you need to say it? He needs to keep saying it, and it's still the truth. He needs to keep saying it until everybody has listened. He needs to remind people that he's stopped the economy from a free fall. 800,000 jobs were being lost a month when he took office. He stopped it from going from 10% unemployment to where we are now. now, which is certainly not where he wanted to be, but it's a much bigger improvement than where we were.
James, if it's going to be all about the economy, why is Barack Obama not doing better than he was a month ago? The economy is unemployment down to 7.8%, Wall Street at a 5-year high, unemployment 4-year low. I mean, all of these things suggest that it should be going in his favour, but it's not. It's going towards Romney.
Well, because he hasn't articulated anything close to a plan for his second term. I mean, we saw an ad from Bill Clinton before. Bill Clinton was a guy who was famous for wanting mulligans and do-overs on the golf course. This is a guy who wants a mulligan, a do-over in the presidency, and the American people aren't going to fall for that. They've seen their lived experience over the last 4 years just be really, really lousy. At the same time, Obama spent trillions and trillions of dollars on stimulus that was supposed to get the economy moving again. If unemployment has dropped, a lot of that's because people are not in the workforce anymore. They've just simply gone and entered that long-term unemployed phase where, they're just not simply counting on the rolls anymore. Petrol prices are through the roof. All sorts of things that, you call the misery index back in 1980 when Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter, a similarly failed Democratic president, one-term president. This is the experience, and he has had 4 years to articulate a plan for the next 4 years, and he just hasn't done that. And voters are switching off.
Just to pick up on something you just said then, James, I've noticed myself that Republicans are trying very hard to turn Obama into Jimmy Carter. Like, in particular, there's a lot of Benghazi talk, embassies and all the rest of it, and you can see they're trying to make the connections. Do you think that is actually working? Because it's clearly a deliberate plan.
Well, I think it's actually a deliberate plan, but it's born out of tragedy. Americans lost their first U.S. ambassador since 1979 in Libya, and in 1979 it was in Afghanistan when Jimmy Carter again screwed up American policy in the Middle East. The debacle in Benghazi, he spent weeks trying to blame it on some guy who made a YouTube video, when in fact it was a coordinated al-Qaeda attack on the Libyan consulate.
To be fair, I don't think Obama was the one who came up with those talking points. I think they came from his advisors. I'm talking his military advisors. CIA,
no, but he was told, and the State Department has walked back. Everybody's been walking away from this idea that it was YouTube. There was, cables from the embassy in, or the consulate in Benghazi saying, you got to send help. You got to send help. There's something happening here. We're insecure, and they refused to do it. So they left an ambassador and his staff and the American consulate, which is American sovereign territory, to be overrun by al-Qaeda. That is just inexcusable.
I'm glad that James is trying so hard to articulate what it was that Romney was trying to say in the recent debates, because Romney clearly didn't have it together when he was trying to explain the presidential nominee's position on this particular issue. The fact of the matter is that they might be trying to paint him as Jimmy Carter, but it's not going to work. And one of the key reasons for that is because this is a different Democratic Party than it was back then. We have a massive effort going on the ground to get out the vote, and we are going to do so. And we're already seeing that work. A lot of the early voting returns are going to show that there is a lean in terms of Barack Obama's favor, and I think that's going to continue.
They usually favoured John Kerry in 2004.
And the momentum now is switching over to Romney.
The momentum refers... very good, James. Momentum? Is that what you said? Okay. Well, then let's go to the Romnesia that Mitt Romney seems to have, which is about his memory loss of what happened from the failed policies of the previous administration.
Just on the momentum, one place where momentum isn't happening is in Ohio, which is really where it needs to happen. How come Romney isn't getting over there?
Well, Ohio's a tough state, but actually some of the internals that I've been hearing about are saying that the suburbs are starting to break Romney's way. But when you looked at that electoral college map before, Florida has already gone over to Romney. That shouldn't have happened. North Carolina has gone over to Romney. That shouldn't have happened. Pennsylvania is becoming quite swingy, and now with that very close... it's that kind of... Hey, it's that kind of state. Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, right? But anyway, no, so we're seeing this momentum, whatever you want to call it, going over towards the Romney camp, and it's making it more and more dicey for Obama and getting a second term. And under these economic circumstances, you just never see presidents get reelected. It's going to be very close.
Yeah, history tells us that, but history also tells us that you need a Bill Clinton or a Ronald Reagan to make a Jimmy Carter or a George H.W. Bush, and a lot will say that Mitt Romney, he ain't that. But history is made by the present, and we're going to see it in 12 days from now. Why is there this disconnect between the state polls, which still show there is this electoral college advantage? If the election was today, Obama won with only 11 electoral college votes to spare. He's leading there. but nationally it's Romney by 3 in all the polls today. Why is there this
It's a
disparity?
country that's largely split politically, and I do think that that's one of the challenges of the next president. And so when we look at these presidential candidates, we need to see whether or not this is the president who's going to pull the country back together. Nobody is going to be able to lead the country politically and make everybody happy, because it's a country half and half. But if you have a president who's going to look to the future and share a vision, I think that that's Barack Obama and not Mitt Romney, who's really been a very divisive leader in his time in office as governor of Massachusetts.
Look, talking about sorry, you can jump in there,
Oh,
James.
look, I was just going to say, I mean, it was an interesting Freudian slip there that Day had when she said the next president. But, you know, putting that aside, when he was in Massachusetts, he did work in a very democratic state, Romney, so he does know how to work with the other side. So that is really something, you know, that Obama has not been able to do, work with Republicans. Yes, Republicans didn't like
I would
it, but...
suggest that national Republicans are different to Massachusetts Democrats.
I would venture
You're
to say
better
you're right.
drivers.
And yet he was able to pass landmark health care legislation, which America certainly
When he had 60
sorely
votes.
needed. He passed it. It happened.
Just about the vision of the future. When we're talking, like, I've been hitting Obama all day about his vision of the future, but Romney, when he's talking about the visions of the future, he talks a lot about what all the tax cuts he's going to give, but he talks very little about exactly how he's going to pay for them. And Obama's been trying to hit him a lot on that.
Well,
why don't you think he's even trying to explain how he's going to pay for this?
Look, we know from Australian politics, from American politics, the incumbent always has an advantage in policy. So when a challenger is trying to explain policy, it's very easy for them to get hit by the advantages of incumbency. But what Romney is really articulating is a broader, higher message, which is America, all of this debt, it has to be paid for eventually. Look abroad, look at Greece, look at the Eurozone. You know, you've got trillions and trillions of dollars worth of debt. Now, eventually, that debt has to come due. You've either got to pay it, you've got to cut spending, you've got to raise taxes, or you've got to inflate your way out of it.
And Obama agrees.
Well, but what's he doing really to cut spending? I mean, he has put hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars into all sorts of things that were failed stimulus programs, and they didn't work. He got seduced by the siren song of Keynesian economics, and it just didn't work.
In 2009.
He is offering 2-to-1 spending cuts to tax increases as part of a grand bargain to solve the fiscal cliff that's looming no matter who wins. That's not a bad deal.
No, but what Romney's offering is a whole package of basically a cafeteria plan of tax deductions where people are able to use the deductions that they need, and you create a much simpler tax code. The problem is there's far too many loopholes, a far too corporatized tax structure in America. I mean, I think everybody here would agree that we need a simpler tax structure.
I would say that the tax structure is certainly complicated, but we certainly can't go to one that's going to tax from the poor to give to the rich, which is exactly what Romney's financial plan is.
Well, how is that? I mean, they're not going to actually go and levy. I mean, we've had this whole 47% comment. Millions and millions of Americans actually don't pay any income tax. The number of Americans
pay payroll tax.
They pay payroll tax, but there's the vast majority, or at that very top pointy end, they're paying much of the tax burden. The same thing in Australia. But I mean, the idea that somehow you're taking from the poor and then shoveling money up to these rich guys, that's just demotic.
I don't know that I necessarily need to ask you, but I will ask you. Predictions, 12 days out. Dave Levine.
I think it's going to be a Barack Obama win, but very close.
Very close.
Mitt Romney, but very, very close. So we're agreed on this close.
That is all the time we have for this edition of Planet America. Next time, we're going to be talking to 2 former state governors, a Democrat and a Republican from 2 important swing states, and how they're calling this race.
And we're going to be telling you everything you've ever wanted to know about the American election ever. Is that over-promising? Possibly. See you next week.
Tis the season for that.